Welcome to Taking Initiative, a podcast presented by Ohio Ballot Protection. I'm joining you again today with my co-host, Pat Blackman.
Hello, Laura.
And we're also joined today by special guest, Allison Russo, one of the candidates running for Ohio's Secretary of State. Welcome, Allison.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Before we get started asking you questions, I just want a quick reminder of why we're here. So as everybody knows, or hopefully knows, in May, Ohioans will be voting in the primaries for candidates for Secretary of State. We've talked quite a bit about how our Secretary of State impacts citizen initiative directly. We've invited all the candidates for Secretary of State to be interviewed on our podcast, and we want to make sure the candidates and the audience knows we are not going to be endorsing any candidate. Instead, we're asking the same questions and giving you an opportunity to get to know them and make a decision for yourself. Pat, can you summarize for us what the Secretary of State does?
I am so fascinated with being able to do this in front of a candidate who is running for Secretary of State. So please forgive me if I make mistakes. But the Secretary of State is a constitutional officer, runs for office every 4 years, has two primary goals: to deal with elections and to also deal with individual corporations and filings. Today we're going to focus on the election part of it. And I'm just going to cite three areas that the Secretary of State is primarily responsible for. And the first one is, of all the 88 counties that have, and they all do in the state of Ohio, a board of elections, the Secretary of State manages and oversees those groups. In addition, the Secretary of State sits on the 5-member Ohio Ballot Board, which is very important, and also manages different aspects of elections all over the state in every election. So just a little bit of history, because I'm a history buff. The Secretary of State was first introduced into Ohio when Ohio became a state in 1803. In 1851, they made it an office, and individuals could be appointed to Secretary of State for 2 years. Then in 1992, it became term limited. So you run for 4 years, you can only sit for 2 consecutive terms. And that's pretty much the history and a little bit of the definition of the Secretary of State.
Well, now it's your turn, Allison. We want to get to know you. First, just tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're running.
Yeah. Well, some people may know me because I currently serve in the state legislature. I have been a member of the Ohio House of Representatives since 2019. I was elected in 2018. During my time in the legislature, I sat on a number of really important committees to the topic that we are discussing today, including general government, where we hear many of the election laws that impact what the Secretary of State does in our boards of elections, constitutional resolutions. So anytime the legislature actually sends something directly to the ballot, because there are 2 pathways these initiatives can go, I've sat on those committees. I also served as the Ohio House Minority Leader, so the top Democrat in the Ohio House, during some very interesting times as it relates to ballot initiatives, specifically when the majority in the legislature tried to push forward raising the threshold for citizen-led ballot initiatives, the passage threshold to 60%, which I opposed, and we were successful in holding that off for several months before it finally went to the ballot and was defeated, as well as a number of the statewide issues, citizen-led initiatives that have come forward, including the Reproductive Rights Amendment and the 2024 redistricting reform that included a citizen-led commission to replace the Ohio Redistricting Commission. I also have sat on the Ohio Redistricting Commission from 2022 to 2023. So I have covered a number of aspects of how this job, the Secretary of State, actually interacts with the legislature, which is quite a bit. A lot of people don't realize that no other statewide office other than the governor interacts as closely with the state legislature, because it is the state legislature that establishes the laws and the rules that dictate how we conduct our elections. The Secretary of State carries those out, but also specifically as it relates to ballot initiatives, there is quite a bit of an interaction with the legislature often, including appointment of members to the ballot board, which I have done as the House Minority Leader, so very familiar with the proceedings of the ballot board as well. So I'm running for Secretary of State because I think, first of all, we need a Secretary of State who is an advocate for voters and who understands that the job is to put the politics aside and to really do what is best for voters and to follow the Constitution and follow the law in the execution of fair, free, and secure elections.
I thought maybe we would delve right into this whole concept of citizen initiatives and where it comes from. And so one of the things I'm specifically concerned about is your role, and I think you gave us a little bit of that in terms of defending direct democracy.
Well, first of all, I am a strong believer in the right to direct democracy. Serving in a legislature that is often out of touch with where voters are on some very important issues has helped me very clearly understand that this right that Ohioans have had, and it's a right given to them in our Ohio Constitution to direct democracy, is incredibly important because it is the final check of citizens on government, whether it be the legislature or the governor, on government when government does not respond to what the citizens want. And so we've seen this come to play recently, certainly with the Reproductive Rights Amendment, with cannabis, and legalizing adult use cannabis, with making attempts to do redistricting reform. We see people out right now collecting signatures for the equality issue, marriage equality and equality. So it is a very important right. As a legislator, and specifically as the House Minority Leader, I have watched as citizens are stepping up and using this right more often, a legislature majority in the legislature, try to roll back some of that right by raising that threshold to 60% for passage. And of course, they couldn't do that because the voters said no. But also other things like trying to raise signature requirements that you have to gather. Or, as it relates to the Secretary of State's office, using these statewide offices that have very important roles to play in this process, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and using the powers in these roles to put their thumb on the scale for these ballot initiatives if they don't agree with them. And, I'm sure we'll talk about this. The Secretary of State has a tremendous amount of power because of the role in the ballot board. In terms of what the ballot language looks like, in terms of, how we certify those signatures, campaign finance, specifically as it relates to ballot issues, as well as, how people easily or don't access the ballot. So all of those things are important, and it's why these statewide offices matter for direct democracy.
Hypothetical question: how would you handle an initiative presented to the board, to the Ohio ballot board, that you oppose?
The answer is simple. It shouldn't matter what my personal opinion is on an issue. My job is to essentially be the referee. And so there are requirements that these initiatives have to meet in order to go before voters. And so that is my job as the Secretary of State. Did they collect an adequate number of signatures that are certified and legal signatures, yes or no? When it comes before the ballot board, is this single subject? Is it multiple issues? And being fair in that determination as the chair of the ballot board. And I think, one of the most important pieces that we've learned is what is the language that voters see about this issue when they go into the voting booth. Is it balanced? Is it accurate? Is it unbiased? And so that is what I consider to be my job as the Secretary of State. It should not matter what my opinion is on the issue. And I'll use a very current example right now. There are citizens at the moment who are collecting signatures to fully repeal our property taxes and put that before voters.
Yep.
I have huge concerns with that approach. I understand people's frustration with property taxes. I believe we need to reform how we do it. Repealing them entirely without some sort of replacement for the revenue for our school districts, our local governments, etc., I think could be very detrimental. So personally, I probably will not be voting for this issue if it comes before us, because I think there are other approaches here. That said, as the Secretary of State, that shouldn't matter. If these individuals who are collecting these signatures get enough and they're legal, if they come before the ballot board and they provide a description that is accurate and unbiased, that is my job as the Secretary of State. And I feel very strongly, and this goes back to me fully believing in the right to direct democracy. It's not my decision about whether or not that should pass. It is the citizens of Ohio and the voters of Ohio who should have the final say in that.
One of the issues that you raised, and I've been doing a lot of research on this, we use the summary single subject language too often. It's a single issue. And I wonder if you have any concerns about how that's being interpreted and what are multiple issues and what's the system that's set up to handle this?
Well, listen, there are certainly ways that this can be manipulated to make it more difficult for citizens to be able to collect those signatures. I mean, we see this right now playing out with the equality ballot initiative, the ballot board, and it was the Secretary of State, LaRose, who was the tie-breaking vote on this, decided that was not one subject, it was two subjects. So now these citizens who are going out and collecting these signatures have to do it on two different petitions. And they're doing it at the same time, but that still adds another layer of burden. They have to meet those signature requirements twice because it's been divided into two subjects. I think certainly there are issues that come before the ballot board that, reasonable people can disagree if this is a single subject or, multiple subjects. But the trick here, and I think, Pat, you will appreciate this, the trick here, some of the guidance around this to the ballot board, has been litigated and is based on court decisions, not necessarily Ohio Revised Code or what's in the Constitution. So then, it's interpretation, legal interpretation. In terms of what is the guidance for the ballot board, and it's very similar to some of the issues we face as legislators as well, because we have a single subject requirement for legislation also that often gets ignored or strictly adhered to, depending on who's making the final call and if they support that or not. For me, as the next Secretary of State, it is to follow as closely the legal guidance and decisions on this as much as possible, but again, not to use the interpretation to put the thumb on the scale for issues that you may not personally agree with. What we don't want to do is overburden citizens who are trying to directly petition voters.
It's not that you as the Secretary of State can change the issues, but you could say that it's multiple issues and cause that much stress. And so I'm curious about what could you see from those cases, especially the Ohio Supreme Court's decision on what is a single issue, so that you don't get confused and say it's not a single issue anymore, it's multiple issues.
Here's part of the challenge that we have at the moment too, is we have a different Supreme Court at the moment. And, I think that there are certainly scenarios where a ballot board can make a decision about whether or not something is single subject or not. It will most certainly get litigated often, will ultimately be determined by the Ohio Supreme Court. Unfortunately, I feel we are in a moment right now in Ohio where our Ohio Supreme Court is much more politicized than it has been in the past for a variety of reasons. And so, I'm not sure that some of the case law that has previously existed here will necessarily stand, depending on, who is litigating this and what the topic is. So I ultimately think that it comes down to a plain language reading of the guidance here, which is, are we dealing with one topic, one subject? So, for example, the equality issue, I think that was one topic and one subject. I think it was only determined to be two because it makes it more difficult. And there were some games being played there to make it more difficult to carry through with the signature collection piece. And so, that is the standard I think that is appropriate is, what is the plain language reading and interpretation of these issues that come forward.
We mentioned a little bit about signature gathering requirements and how not too long ago there was conversation about making it more difficult. Just curious your thoughts on signature gathering. Is it fair as it is? Is there anything that, you, if it were in your control, might change?
Yeah, well, certainly since I have been in the legislature, there have been a number of conversations and potential efforts to increase that signature threshold, and certain groups that have been pushing for that, ultimately to make it more difficult, whether it be a statute through initiatives, a constitutional change, or even a citizen-led referendum, which we haven't talked about the referendum as well, but that is where you can directly repeal legislation that is passed by the General Assembly within 90 days of the governor signing something into law. Listen, I think that the signature requirements that we have right now for all of those efforts are difficult enough. We have a large number of initiatives, citizen-led initiatives, that start and never actually make it to completion, or referendum efforts that start and never actually make it to completion because the threshold is so high. So anyone who tries to make the argument, that we have too many of these, the evidence simply does not support that. I mean, just in the last year and a half, we've had efforts to try to repeal Senate Bill 1, which was an attack on higher education that was passed by the legislature, an effort to repeal changes to the cannabis marijuana law that just failed, a few weeks ago. Those are just the referendum thresholds, which are lower than constitutional amendments. But it just goes to show, this is incredibly difficult. A lot of these efforts are grassroots efforts. There's not a lot of money behind these signature collection efforts, all of the different hurdles that have been put in place, for people who are collecting those signatures and what they have to do to collect those signatures. It is high enough, and I think any changes that make it more difficult, I am opposed to, because again, so few actually make it all the way through to come before voters.
Yeah, we actually had a chance to talk to Dr. Mandy Falbum, who led the SB1 referendum. Fascinating story. They worked so hard.
Truly a grassroots effort. Truly. It was remarkable how many they were able to collect in that compressed time frame, because again, we have a statewide office, in this case it's the Attorney General, that can delay even the start of that signature collection process. So they had a very compressed window and, got very close, but just couldn't quite make it to the requirements.
You have given us a lot of good information with respect to single issues and what you should be looking for. And I'm curious as to what do you think about what happens with the final language that goes on the ballot? Do you have some thoughts about that? Because
I do.
one thing we want to stress is that we're trying to educate the public as to what this system looks like and what it has gone through. And so your interpretation of what the final ballot language should look like and what standard you would use would be helpful.
Yeah, no, I have very strong opinions about this. There is language that is actually approved before you even begin collecting signatures that has to be presented on that petition. And it's usually a quick summary of that language, right? That is approved. That's approved by the Attorney General. And then once you collect those signatures and you meet the requirements, it then comes before the ballot board, and there is language that voters see when they go into the voting booth. To me, it has always perplexed me that we don't at least default back to the language that was used originally and already approved, right, by the Attorney General. Why that is not the default language that we go back to, but that has not been the case. What we have seen is, under this Secretary of State, changes to that language, making it longer, making it not even sound like the same thing that was originally collected. That's certainly what happened in 2024. So I think, it's important for me, first of all, to be consistent with that original language that was approved. But number two, we're talking about people who are coming into a voting booth. And what we have learned is if you make things, number one, too difficult to read, because you want to make sure that the average person can understand in plain language what they are voting on. But number two, if it is too long, you actually end up creating things like longer lines to vote because people are standing there, trying to read and figure it out if they haven't done their research beforehand. And we can't assume that everyone does their research on these issues beforehand, depending on what the issue is. So consistent, plain language, easy to understand, relatively short that you can read in a quick period of time. And then I think most importantly, it has to be unbiased and accurate. And, we're talking about human beings on a ballot board, so there's going to be some bias in it. But as unbiased as possible, I think is the appropriate approach to take here. And the other thing that I will just say is, when Jennifer Brunner was Secretary of State, during the ballot board meetings when ballot language was being discussed, they actually actively edited in the proceeding so that it was transparent as to any of the changes that were going to be made and the discussions about how to craft the ballot language. They did that in a public space that added transparency to the process. And I would like to see that restored with me as Secretary of State. Let's do that in front of the public, not behind closed doors that the public doesn't get to see until the last minute right before the ballot board, or sometimes, as was the case in 2024 with the redistricting language, literally they came back from a break and introduced it at the last minute. I was at that ballot board when that happened. So opening up the transparency of how these decisions are made, I think is incredibly important.
I mean, it sounds like you definitely have ideas, different ways of maybe running the Secretary of State office and different goals than maybe, the current Secretary of State. Can you just walk us through what your goals would be, what changes you might see enacting?
Most importantly for me, in all the operations of the Secretary of State, is to add trust and transparency back to that office. And, there are a lot of decisions that the Secretary of State makes, sometimes tie-breaking decisions, when there's disagreement, for example, at a board of elections about certifying a candidate or an issue, or whatever the case may be. It does come to the Secretary of State to be that tie-breaking vote. Being transparent in why that decision was made, being consistent in why that decision was made. That's just one piece of this because, to me, the biggest threat to our elections right now is this distrust that is being fomented through disinformation. And part of how we combat that is we add transparency to all of the processes, whether it's how we run our elections, how decisions are made, how we operate on the ballot board. That is incredibly important. The other thing that I would like to see a more focus on and resources dedicated towards is voter education and voter engagement and outreach. And that is going to require not just resources dedicated to those efforts. How do we make voting information and using technology, how do we make that convenient and accessible to all voters? But it's also about building coalitions outside of the Secretary of State's office, with our schools, with our universities, with our faith communities, with nonprofit groups who work in this space, to better engage Ohioans so that they, number one, have a seat at the table through their voter registration, but number two, actually have a voice at the table as well through their vote. And so we've got a lot of work to do in this space. And that is the work that really, really excites me here. And then I think third and most important is what we're talking about today, is to give citizens a fair shot when they come forward with these initiatives or referendums, and to stop putting our thumb on the scale because we agree or don't with an issue. To me, direct democracy is about voters having the final say.
I think that's a really good point because I want to stress that this is a part of the Constitution that started in 1912 during one of the magnificent constitutional conventions that they had. And so we need to be mindful of that.
And FDR or Teddy Roosevelt came and
Teddy
actually
Roosevelt,
spoke
yes.
at that. And, he was coming off of a period of time where we had major corruption in our federal government. And, government, mainly Congress, that was not working for the people. And so he came and spoke about why direct democracy was so important, because it is a check. When you've got a legislature that is corrupt, that is non-responsive, it is the final check that citizens have. And not every state has this right. Ohio is unique in that, we're one of a handful of states that has this right, and it's so precious and so important. And it's why I am dedicated as a legislator currently, but also as the Secretary of State, to ensuring that we uphold that right.
I thought maybe you could delve into what system you would use for purging voters from the voter roll.
Well, first of all, let me be very clear that maintaining accurate voting rolls is important. It's absolutely important. So we want to make sure, when people move out of state, they're no longer eligible, when people pass away, that we are maintaining accurate voting rolls. So some amount of, I don't want to call it purging, but ensuring that you've got clean and accurate voting rolls should happen and has happened for decades. Now, in the past, what we have used is something called the ERIC system, and it was a multi-state coalition of secretaries of states and states coming together to basically be able to bounce your data off, so that if someone, for example, moved to Pennsylvania and there was evidence that they had newly registered in Pennsylvania, you would know, okay, let's remove them from Ohio's voting rolls. This current Secretary of State actually took us out of that system, as well as many other Republican secretaries of states, because of basically political attacks on Eric. So there were Republicans who suddenly said, this is a partisan data set. It's not. There was no evidence of this. And so the Secretary of State, our best tool for maintaining accurate data rolls, he took us out of, essentially. So now, we see efforts and actually state law that recently passed that dictates that now, in order to maintain these voter rolls, number one, you have to match them with things like the BMV data set, something called the SAVE data set, which is a federal data set that, supposedly indicates if someone is a citizen or not. The problem is that we know that there are a lot of errors in both of those data sets, and they are not always up to date. And so you get people erroneously flagged to be quote unquote, purged or checked or whatever, because of an error that is not actually theirs. And we have had this Secretary of State and the previous Secretary of State, John Husted, before him, who would remove people from voting rolls simply because they did not participate in a certain number of elections. And I think that that is wrong. Someone should not be penalized and lose their voter registration just because they weren't inspired by a candidate, for a couple of election cycles. Now, unfortunately, that is also dictated in state law. So the Secretary of State has to do that. But for me as Secretary of State, again, I have to follow what is in state law. That's just the reality of the relationship between the Secretary of State as an executive position and the legislature. However, I feel very strongly I should not be going beyond the plain language of the law to do things even more that may erroneously take people and remove them from the voter rolls. And I should ensure that any process that state law requires me to do, that we are doing that in a way that accurately identifies folks who legitimately should be removed from the voter rolls because they've moved, they passed away, they're not eligible to vote, whatever the case may be.
What are your thoughts on the Secretary of State right now being a partisan role? I mean, people are running as Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, but to your point, you have to adjudicate for everybody in the state. So just curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I actually feel very strongly this shouldn't be a partisan office, and I say that when I'm talking to voters about this as well, because again, it shouldn't matter if you agree with a candidate or not, if you agree with an issue or not as Secretary of State. That should have absolutely no bearing on how you carry out the duties as Secretary of State. So to me, this should be a nonpartisan office. It is a partisan office, but I think that, anyone who serves in this role should act in as nonpartisan of a way as possible. My commitment is as Secretary of State, I will not be endorsing candidates. I will not be putting yard signs in my yard, on issues or candidates because, my job is to be a referee, not a player on the field. And, if you want to trust a Secretary of State to carry out fair and free and secure and unbiased elections, I think you have to make that commitment as someone who holds this office.
How have you prepared yourself for this role? Because this is a lot different than being in the legislature.
That's right. Well, I feel very strongly that this is a role that requires experience. And the experience that I have gained over the last 8 years working on a number of these issues around election integrity, working on things like the Ohio Redistricting Commission and constitutional resolutions, working with our elections officials as this legislation has come forward and understanding, what their needs are, what their concerns are, and some of the things that they are facing, the resource constraints that they are facing, knowing how to navigate the levers of power within the legislature, because again, often the Secretary of State has to come before this legislature and advocate for or against things. Understanding the state budget process, because the Secretary of State is reliant on the state budget process to both fund our elections and the Secretary of State operations. That is incredibly important. I think in this moment in time, when I feel very strongly that our democracy is under threat, and we are seeing that every day, whether it's coming from the state legislature or it's coming from the president himself, that we need a Secretary of State who can go in on day one with that experience and to be able to hit the ground running because there is too much at stake. Our elections are too important. Voting is too important. And, the ability of people to have government that is accountable and transparent to them is just too important.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate both of you. This has been a great conversation.